In this game, our second game that we're examining, we're going to take it from this position, which is just before white's 23rd move. And, well, we can see that there is a great space advantage for white. I would say that this is the main imbalance that stands out, and indeed we examined this game previously in the positional chess series, focusing on that space advantage. But here, of course, we are focusing on open and semi-open files. And what we notice is that for now, all of the pawns are on the board and therefore there are no open or semi-open files. But white is the one who is capable of breaking, and therefore it is up to him whether or not he wishes to, create at least one open file. That open file would happen after b5. If black, let's say, does absolutely nothing, then white can capture on the next move, and we would have an open b file. More than likely, in the event of the move b5, black would recapture with the a pawn. And then after a takes b5, we see that one file has been opened, the a file, and the b file continues to have tension here between the b and c pawns, and so likely this one will also open up in the future. Of course, Capablanca chose not to do this because, for now, this would be almost like white doing the work for black, right? You push all your pawns, and then black all of a sudden is the only one who is having an open file. And in fact, black could begin with moves such as rook to a3, hitting this bishop, and let's say that you were to drop the bishop back, then the move knight g4, and before you know it, that open file has materialized into activity, and that activity means pressure in one of the weaker points of your position. Not to say, of course, that white has no way of dealing with this threat. For example, rook to c3 would deal with it, but nevertheless, we don't want black to reach this kind of level of activity. However, in the future, white will very happily play the move pawn to b5 when the moment is right. And what makes the moment right? The first thing is that black should not benefit as much from the opening up of the a file as white would from the eventual opening up of the b file, if, for example, white were to continue with b takes c6. Alternatively, white should be able to get more benefit from moving back into the a file if he chooses not to operate on the b file after all. So those are the two scenarios under which white will be very happy to crack open the position, that he is either able to get more value out of the control of the b file than black is out of any activity on the a file, or he is able to actually switch back over to the a file and perhaps actually make more use of it than black, even though he may already be here. Now, I do want to point out one thing. Let's imagine that black plays the move knight to g4. Let's say just any old move. White kicks out the knight, and now knight f6, let's say. We get this position, and white decides that he wants to challenge on the a file. Well, one of the reasons why white may actually come out on top, even though black got there first, is because after a move such as b6, let's imagine king goes to g7, and white now goes rook to a1, we see that this structure here is more advanced for white. And this advanced nature allows white options that are unavailable to black. Here's one example. White can play the move rook to a5, from where the queen is supporting the rook. Black, on the other hand, does not have an equivalent option such as rook to a3, from where the queen could be supporting the rook were it not for the advanced pawns, right? So we're seeing this as one example. Black also struggles perhaps to bring his queen into play to support the a8 square and to then create some kind of an exchange. And once again, that's more of a struggle for black because of that limit in space. Now, black could, for instance, play moves such as queen to d8 to support a8 and maybe to threaten rook takes, and then to bring over the other rook. But even at that, let's imagine some move like knight e5, rook takes, and now rook a8. We see that white could either repeat the move rook to a5, or he could even go rook a7, once again In both cases, he is using space advantage to afford him kind of flexibility of movement that black does not have. And so the important takeaway of this is that open files and how well positioned you are to take advantage of them is often dependent on how much space you have. And in general, if you do have more space and more advanced pawn structure, it can help you to actually better control the file. And we saw bits of that in the first game that we examined, the Karpov-Unzicker game. With that said, let's go back to the Capablanca game, where in this position after knight h6, Capablanca decided that there was no rush, very similar to how Karpov had an unrushed approach to creating any kind of activity along the A file. Here, Capablanca understands that b5 is not a move that he'll be unable to play, say 5 or 10 moves down the line. He'll always have this option available to him. So for now, he plays h3, which takes away the g4 square and makes this knight not so effective. The knight goes back to f7, and now he plays this move pawn to g4. And once again, we're kind of seeing that same pattern that we saw in the Karpov game unfolding, where white clearly has an advantage on the queenside, in this case a space advantage and the possibility to open up files in his favor at the right moment. But he considers that since that advantage is there and it's not going away anytime soon, he's going to try and make progress on the king side as well. And, well, in a sense, accumulate advantages across the board. Black here responds with the move bishop to d7. White goes rook to c2. And after king h8, he reveals the purpose of this move, rook c2, this rook lift, rook goes to g2. Now black plays rook g8, a logical follow-up to king h8. And it's at this moment where maybe you are expecting g takes f5 in order to open up files, either e takes f5, leading to the creation of this semi-open file typically in black's favor, or in the event of g takes f5, no semi-open file, but instead just an open file. However, the question perhaps needs to be asked once again, right? Just like when we were speaking about the immediate pawn push b5, and there was an element of uncertainty as to whether such a position as this is actually truly clearly in white's favor or not, whether it's as big of an advantage as he could have obtained or whether he cashed in a little bit too early. Similar to this, well, we could ask the same questions here after rook goes to g8 and then g takes f5 and g takes f5. It's clear that a radical change has occurred in the position, the g file is now open, but what is less clear is who exactly it favors. Here black, for example, after let's say rook takes g8, the white king is perhaps feeling a little bit less sheltered than the black king. In fact, I personally don't think that this is the case. I think that white is still doing quite well here, namely because white has better minor pieces. The bishop has a little bit more freedom of movement in the future, and this knight will also have some strong jumps to e5 or g5, whereas this knight is kind of a little bit more passively placed. It can never really jump to any of these squares, and even if it somehow got to h6, the next forward jumps of f5 and g4 are occupied. But the actual activity that has taken place along the g file, that opening up of the file, is not necessarily in white's favor. Therefore, once again, we must always ask ourselves this question when we're opening up a file. Let's not just open up files for the sake of it. Instead, we need to consider if the positions that arise afterwards are actually favoring us or favoring our opponent, because we do not want to do the work for our opponent. White here instead chose to move pawn to g5, locking up the g file. The idea with this move is, of course, not to just progressively close up the entire position, but rather that having recognized that g takes f5, or maybe even g takes f5, e takes f5, is a little bit less of an achievement than white would like, he locks up the g file in order to make way for the possibility of opening up the h file in the near future. So Black played queen d8 and indeed h4, king g7 and now h5. This is a very typical idea in chess where this pawn on h5 doesn't actually have to be defended, because if black is to capture, then not only would his pawn structure be ruined, but this pawn on h5 would be a very, very soft target and white could pick it up in the near future regardless. So therefore, the defending side generally in these situations doesn't capture. And instead here, Treyball played the move rook to h8. This move makes a lot of sense because the point is that if white now captures, black will recapture and black's rook will already be on the h-file. And this is an important point to keep in mind when you are fighting against an opponent who is trying to create open files. Like, even though here in this situation, black is not able himself to, let's say, resolve this tension favorably, because as mentioned, the structure would be poor, what he can do is he can play prophylactically. He can post his pieces prophylactically. This rook is on h8, and this rook here is on a8. And so as white opens up files, black cannot control that portion, but he understands which files will open up, and he places his pieces accordingly. White here played the move rook to h2, and there was some shuffling around for the next few moves. At this point, white now played rook b to h1. And similarly to Karpov, he builds up the pressure along the h-file, and at any given moment at the right time, he will play h takes g6. Black now plays rook a g8 in order to defend on g6, and a little bit more shuffling back and forth. Queen a1, rook b8. Notice how black is just sort of passively waiting, because he himself doesn't have any good breaks at his disposal. If he plays b6, then the pawn on a6 is going to be very weak. If he plays b5, then after a takes b5, a takes b5, the a-file will have been opened by black for white anyway. And of course, after b5, white can simply choose to maintain the tension. And once again, there would be a favorable tension for black. Let me just quickly show this. White here played the move queen to a3. So let's imagine that here in this position, black had gone pawn to b5. Well, white would have the option of c takes b6, after which the black structure would be left fragmented. The option of a takes b5. And in this case, this is what I was saying, that in a sense, it's black who has done the work for white. And now white could, for example, shift the rook on over to a1 to prevent the move rook a8 and hope to be able to make progress on the a-file. And alternatively, after the move b5, white could simply do neither capture on b6 nor capture on b5, and instead he could play a move such as rook to a1. The idea being that b takes a4 would be problematic not only because the a6 pawn is hanging, but also because if, let's say, queen takes a4, then white is having this very, very nice, compact pawn chain, whereas for black, he has this very, very bad weakness on a6. So, those are the reasons why b5 was not played. We see that black cannot resolve the tension or do anything on the queen side or on the king side in a way that favors him structurally. So therefore, black went rook b to g8, and now white finally broke on b5. Notice that he has built up the pressure very, very nicely here on the king side, and at any given moment, he can capture on g6. And this is tying black down. Black here played the move a takes b5, agreeing to an opening up of the a-file after a takes b5 here. Now, once again, there was no way to really avoid this. If, for example, a move like pawn to a5 were to be played, white would have the option of b6 here, disconnecting the pawns on b7 and a5, and ganging up on this point of a5. And notice one thing, white can put pressure on this pawn on a5 with the queen, but you might argue, if you wanted to play devil's advocate, that after something like queen d8, queen c3, black could just go queen a8 and keep the queen at bay. However, the problem is that white can actually bring more pressure to bear down on this point to a5. What he can do is he can use this knight and go knight d2, knight b3, and tackle the pawn on a5. And so once again, we see this fantastic interplay between all the positional elements. And this is something that we'll be talking about in more depth in the full game section for those of you who are watching the full series. You know, the way in which, for example, in this position here, after the move b5, black did not consider the move a5, which would have the kind of the upshot that it would keep the files more closed on the queen side. But unfortunately, he cannot do so because the space constraints means that when the pawn on a5 would be left disconnected after this sequence a5, b6, the space constraints means that white can actually challenge the pawn on a5 with two pieces, whereas black cannot actually put two pieces defending the pawn on a5 because, for example, he could not put both a rook and a queen somewhere on the a file since black controls a7 and a6. And so because of this, after b5, black consents to opening up the a file and a takes b5 is played. However, here, very, very nice move is Zwischenschach, an in-between check played by Capablanca. Here he plays the move h6 check. And at the last moment actually ends up, he sort of threatened that he would open up the G file, if you remember, and then he threatened that he was going to open up the H file. And in the end, he locks both files up. But what did he accomplish with that? Well, we already discussed what he accomplished with the opening up of the G file. But now, by locking up the H file, he forces king to go back to f8, and now he captures on b5. And what we notice is that these rooks are completely out of place. Now, black plays king e7 in order to try and get those rooks back into the action, specifically into the a file. White plays pawn to b6, hits the queen, and forces the queen back. Now again, the space advantage is the big factor in play here, but although we focused on that previously, we have to focus on that action along both the H and the A files, and how even though in this particular instance here, the H file remains closed, the power that just the threat had on black's play. And this is why in chess we often say that the threat is stronger than the execution. White now shifts his focus back onto the A file, plays rook a1, and after rook c8, we notice, by the way, black cannot actually play a move like rook a8 himself because of the severe lack of space. And a move like queen a8 would just be met by something like queen b2. Now you would have to move the queen back and then rook a7. And we see once again that support that the b6 pawn lends. And once again, we also see that one of the big purposes of planting a rook on this open file is to eventually break into the opponent's position and to create a threat against whatever targets are available. Therefore, after rook a1, black instead just chose to move rook c8, and now we see queen b4, rook h d8, rook a7, that idea we just mentioned, king f8, rook h1, refocusing that rook back onto the open file, bishop e8, and rook ha1. There's only one open file in the position, but it provides enough resources for white to be able to break down the black position. So king g8, rook 1 to a4, king f8, and queen a3. Once again, that Alekhine's gun is set up here. We remember Karpov threatened to do so in the last game, and here Capablanca actually, in fact, does so. Black goes king g8, king g3, a little bit of shuffling around, trying to sort of optimize the placement of your pieces. This is a little different of a point than what we've been talking about, but usually why white has, for example, time to do something like this, and actually we'll notice if we fast forward that he eventually goes back, he changes his mind and he goes back. The reason why you have so much time to do this is because the urgency of your planning, how fast your plan must be, is dependent on how fast your opponent's plan is, right? And how quick you need to react and how quickly he's going to create concrete threats against your position. But here, if we notice what has black been doing in the last few moves, well, he's just been shuffling his pieces back and forth. Take a look at his king. King to g8, king to f8, king to back to g8. Now the bishop to d7, king to h8, king back, king again, bishop back to e8. We see that black is completely without a plan, and so white can take as much time as he needs to make sure that everything is as well placed as possible before taking concrete action. And this, by the way, has a nice benefit for those of you who are already tournament players. One thing that is worth remembering is that if you do this kind of patient maneuvering and just trying to get the conditions right, you have to be careful that you don't do this in more open boards where, as I say, your opponent's plans can be much faster. But if you do it in more closed boards or boards where your opponent just doesn't have any kind of action plan, one of the advantages, besides, the objective value of having your pieces as well placed as possible, one of the advantages is that mentally you drain your opponent. It's very, very unpleasant to have to play this kind of a position from the black side. So that's a little bit of an aside, but just a tip that, you may wish to consider cultivating a bit of patience with this kind of an edge if you find yourself in these kind of positions in the future. Anyway, just to conclude this particular game, after bishop e8, white went knight to d2, bishop d7, and you might be wondering why this knight has left the f3 square where, it had this potential jump to e5. We quickly realize what Capablanca intends. The knight goes to b3, and after rook e8, the knight goes to a5. The point on b7 is about to collapse. Black plays the move knight d8, but white has a nice tactical finish, bishop to a6. There is no way to defend this point, so black is forced to capture the bishop, and now rook takes d7. And we see that really this is very, very bad news for black because this rook is extremely active and this pawn on a6 is extremely weak, as is the pawn on c6. Black played rook e7 and that accelerated his loss. White played the move rook takes d8 check, and after rook takes d8, knight takes c6, he won a pawn. He will be recovering his exchange because of this fork on the next move, and he will pick up the pawn on a6, and so here black resigned. But what is very, very interesting is that it wasn't, let's say, that Capablanca won because of this tactical shot in the end. It wasn't even that Capablanca won because of this tactical shot. He won because of a combination of that space advantage, that huge space advantage that he accumulated, and play along both the H file and the A file. On the H file, everything got locked up, but just the threat of opening up the file is what led black down the path, if we fast forward here, is what led black down the path of placing first one rook on h8 and then the second rook on g8, just to keep the g6 and h7 structure and the king side from collapsing. And it was this that gave white the possibility, having sort of distracted his opponent along the king side, gave him the possibility of making inwards on the queen side. He struck with b5, and after a takes b5, after black had no choice but to consent to opening up the queen side, it's only then that white played h6 check and sort of KO'd these rooks for long enough that black was unable to contest that a file. Remember, we said if white in this position here, if you recall at the very beginning, we mentioned that Capablanca proceeded with the move h3, but we talked about the possibility of b5, and we saw that if b5 happens, a takes b5, and now rook a3 maybe gives black a little bit more play than he should be given. At least black is well prepared for that opening up of the a file. So instead, what white did is he waited, understanding that b5 would be playable at a later, hopefully more favorable point in the game. He waited for a while, he created the threat of an open file on the H file and distracted dealing with that second potential opening up of the position, black's pieces all got stuck over on the king side, and it was only then that he finally broke through with his idea of b5 right here. Only after the move rook b g8 did b5 occur, a takes b5, and even before opening up the a file, he took a move to lock down those rooks for long enough that after a takes b5, black was completely unable to challenge the a file. King e7, b6, queen b8, and we see rook a1, complete domination of the a file, and then that build up, both rooks now on the a file, Alekhine's gun established, and then optimizing the remaining pieces, understanding that black just does not have enough time, followed finally by this maneuver, deadly maneuver of the minor piece onto b7, which is under pressure because that rook on a7 invaded. It was the first white piece that invaded the black half of the board. If we see here, we see if we split the board like this, this is the only piece right now that is in the half of the board. And after knight b3, rook e8, the second piece arrives again along that open a file. And then after knight d8, a third piece arrives again along the a file. And this is what leads to the collapse of the black position. So I hope that you learned quite a lot from this game and that you also enjoyed it. For those of you who have already seen this game from earlier on in the series, well, I hope that it was a worthwhile review and of course a different slant on it. The first time that we examined it, it was more from the space perspective. But in any case, a very, very famous and I think very aesthetically pleasing game. And so I hope you enjoyed it, and let's move on to the next game. So I shall see you there, guys.